Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. Mars makes it as easy as possible for you to get your pharmaceutical, medtech, or digital health product to the market and, of course, get the price it deserves. My name is Stefan Walzer. I'm the founder of Mars and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics already since 2004. Additionally, I founded the consultancy P&N Pricing and Negotiations in Healthcare based in Toronto, Canada, which supports companies and individuals globally by coaching, simulations, and training, especially on negotiations. This service is including our innovative virtual reality simulation program and is part of the Negotiation Lab. And now let's learn about the market access and reimbursement systems around the globe. Market access and reimbursement, obviously not only an important topic for sure, especially the ones who are listening to our podcast in the last couple of months and years, that is quite clear, but especially if you maybe consider further what might be happening, will be happening, not might, in roughly 2 years' time. And we have just heard January 2023 that in Q4 2024, so basically tomorrow, the EU Joint HTA will start to be implemented at least for oncology and ATMP products across Europe. I think important to consider here is still that you will still have on a national level the different submission processes. So it's not just on a European level. And then you, for example, have already granted a benefit and a benefit rating, as you might have seen that on a European Medicine Agency level, so regulatory level, but it's rather the first step into the markets across Europe. I think what we still know is for sure that the different HTA agencies are kind of still debating about the acceptable evidence base on that joint EU HTA level. So, for example, which endpoints, which kind of studies might also be available and acceptable, which might especially be maybe difficult in the area of ATMPs. In Germany, for example, you have seen that a lot of ATMPs went through the benefit assessment, got a non-quantifiable added benefit granted because of the legal environment and regulation Germany has adopted, especially for those products. But you have also seen that some or a good number of those ATMPs needed to run registries in order to collect further data. But still, that has happened while having positive reimbursement, and I think at least for most of them, a quite attractive price. That is as well a key difference, and that's, I think, maybe also a bit of a concern how and in which ways the EU Joint HTA might be implemented. In any way, I think core question still remains, is and are the different countries maybe already ready for the EU Joint HTA? And if not, how would in any way look the process like starting already end of next year? For that discussion, I've invited this time two guests, both from Partners for Access, a consultancy company in the UK. One is Priyanka Kiritharan. She is a partner for Partners for Access and has also worked beforehand as a clinical project manager at the Hammersmith Medicines Research Limited. And the second guest is Sheppard. She's consultant at Partners for Access and has also worked beforehand at different consultancy before she joined Partners for Access. Good, great. Good morning, Chloe. Good morning, Priyanka. Good morning out of Germany into the UK, I presume, right?
Yes, good morning from sunny London this morning.
Sunny London is also good. But I mean, it is already quite interesting that we come together, right? I mean, discussing EU Joint HTA, having the still also bigger kind of difficulty, I would say, with the Brexit, but we can probably put that a bit aside. I think it's still the kind of key question to me if the EU Joint HTA might make life easier, especially for pharmaceutical and later on also medical device companies. Not exactly sure, but I mean, ultimately, the whole kind of concept, if I want to say it like that, is approaching quite fast. What are your thoughts, especially after you have also developed a quite nice blog article? Are individual country HTA organizations and or country processes itself, the systems, really prepared yet for it?
I'm happy to take that question, Stefan. Thank you. I think it's a great question, and to me, I think the short answer to that is no. And reason being, I think, as you've mentioned, I think everyone is aware that, this massive change is about to happen, and where we are approaching it quite quickly. And as this change is on the horizon, I think there's a sense. I think I sense that there's a lot of uncertainty amongst HTA organizations, but also in industry as well, and other stakeholders. And despite this imminent change or imminent changes, I think it's safe to say that nobody really knows what the outcome is going to be until it actually comes into effect, or we come closer to the time. And time is already ticking. So with this forthcoming regulation, I think it's been in development for several years. And it's only now that we're approaching closer to the implementation date that we're hearing more about, the progress of UNETA. We've had some updates recently about when we're expecting these final deliverables, and with the revised dates that were released in January, we now know that JCAs are set to take from Q4 2024. And having said that, that just leaves under 2 years to ensure there's alignment between HTA organizations and UNETA. And to me, I think at the moment, there seems to be this gaping hole in the expectations of what HTA methodology at the joint level would look like, and what kind of evidence requirements are needed for the JCA. So in terms of HTA countries being prepared, well, the UNETA consortium encompasses quite a large stakeholder network, and this also includes representatives from each member state. And, the stakeholder network has been closely involved in the development of UNETA, and they have actually had the opportunity to provide feedback on the deliverables on a few occasions. So, these member states are being kept in the loop. They do know what's going on. But of course, I think it's going to take quite some time for these individual member states to implement these changes to their respective countries. And at the moment, like I said, I don't think there's an alignment there. And I just want to add that Marcus Guardian, who's the Chief Operating Officer, and I think I also included this in the recent blog you were referring to, that there's been over 400 comments on the recently shared deliverables. And although we've been hearing a lot from industry and their perspective, and we know that there's quite a lot of discontentment amongst pharma associations and industry on the progress, and they believe that their feedback hasn't been addressed. But to date, I've not really heard. I'm not sure if you have, Stefan, but or Chloe. I'm not sure what the stance of these individual member states are. I don't think we've heard too much communication from them. All I know is that with time ticking, it doesn't seem like we're any closer to reaching an agreement on what the evidence requirements are. And without this, to answer your question simply, I think it will be quite difficult and dare I say, almost impossible for HTA bodies to be well prepared for 2025.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I can only agree. I mean, that's also my kind of current view there. It's probably already difficult to see, I mean, in which ways really the process would look like in detail, right? Meaning how and which kind of, let's say, documents would need to be prepared. I think the other question still, I mean, as you already said, I think twice in the last couple of minutes, I mean, what needs to be prepared in terms of, for example, endpoints, or generally, let's say, the acceptable evidence base, I mean, which is already quite difficult. I mean, if you compare already now the outcomes of different reimbursement submissions across Europe, I mean, you see already big differences, right? Whether it's just subgrouping for just some, reimbursement just for some subgroups, or a rejection of reimbursement, or big differences in terms of prices, et cetera, et cetera. So it will be really interesting to see how such a kind of system could really work on a European level.
No, I completely concur. And I just want to highlight that, although, it seems like, it's slightly a negative stance here, and I'm being a bit skeptical, but on the whole, I think, UNETA is a great idea. And if we can really mirror or we can materialize, UNETA's vision, I think it will be great, for industry, for manufacturers, for patients. But like you said, without this alignment on what the evidence requirements are, I think it will be very difficult. And, historically, as you and I both know, I think there's been some conflict or, differing opinions between member states on, what's considered as acceptable evidence. A clinical endpoint, that's accepted in one member state might not be in another. And, even if we're talking about standard of care, for example, in a therapeutic indication, this also might vary between member states. So, yeah, I think, without this alignment, it's going to be very difficult. And I think, Stefan, you've also mentioned in previous conversations and podcasts that, you've referred to diabetes as an example. And, if we're looking at some of the recently approved, anti-diabetic type 2 medications, for example, in France, we're seeing a lot more that are available compared to Germany, and there's been some pushback there. So again, it comes down to the evidence requirements, right? And different individual member states will have different requirements and what they believe is acceptable. So there needs to be this alignment at this joint level.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. I mean, maybe what we can do here is maybe really taking a step backwards. I think before going into the details, could you maybe quickly describe again, for especially maybe the ones not that 100%, let's say, familiar with the current kind of process and the discussion the last couple of years around the Joint HTA? What is the idea around EU Joint HTA, and how would it, top level, basically ideally look like? I mean, we have already discussed a lot about the details, but what is it really more or less around? Let's say if you would, let's say, have a look on the current discussions from a US perspective, not having had any experience yet with Europe, what would be the kind of, let's say, key takeaways you would, or maybe how you would potentially even summarize it?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. I'm happy to take this one. I think ultimately it's important to understand the context of where we're at the moment in terms of the HTA systems that exist in Europe are very much the responsibility of the individual member states. And as Priyanka's already touched upon, and as we've already discussed, the evidence requirements, the methodologies that those individual countries are using to evaluate the clinical elements of products and the clinical value of products is very different. It's very fragmented. There's no kind of alignment. And what the EU HTA regulation aims to do is to provide a system where we can have a joint clinical assessment that's done at the European level, which forms as a basis then for the individual member states to make pricing reimbursement decisions. Now, it sounds great, I think. And if we look at the EMA, for example, and what the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, does, is there's a centralized process for granting marketing authorizations. And that's essentially, I think, what we're trying to get to here, is to have a kind of centralized clinical assessment done to ultimately try and achieve more equitable access to medicines across Europe, more timely access to medicines across Europe, and reduce the resources that these individual member states are needing to put into this process, and kind of get some efficiency. So that's ultimately the goal. I think, as we've said, the background to this has been it's been a long time coming. That the regulation's been in discussions for several years, and we're only just now seeing kind of the implementation finally after this regulation's been adopted. So I think we're still in quite the initial stages of everything, as we've said. But bottom line is, we're trying to get the ultimate goal is kind of more uniform, timely access to medicines across Europe.
Where I think we would all agree that this is a good idea, right? I mean, the interesting part is basically, I mean, as you already as well said it and mentioned it, is how fast and in which ways those kind of processes would really be, I would say, rather lived, right? I mean, when I had early discussions already months and probably even years ago with some market access experts in Spain, whether they would believe, for example, that EU Joint HTA would really make products early available to individuals, to the patient across Europe. I mean, he was starting to laugh. And I was just asking him, I mean, why the hell are you now laughing here, right? The question was serious. And he was, yes, of course, it is serious. It's especially serious for the patient, right? But if you would compare basically the current discussions with the process he has seen in Spain, where you have that national kind of process where everybody was also expecting that because of the national decision, products and new therapies would be available sooner to patients. He as well just said, I mean, that was just a dream, right? Because still the regions and even the local payers have still their own processes. Yes, of course, Europe is not Spain, right? But I mean, you also just said, I mean, sometimes on a European level, let's say processes and decisions are really, really, let's say, lasting long, or sometimes even delayed. So I'm also a bit sarcastic, maybe just saying because of that EU Joint HTA, access might even be further delayed, right? Would you disagree with that?
I'm happy to take this, Stefan. No, I think that's you've made a really great point there, and it from that perspective, it is a bit ironic, isn't it? Because the whole point, the whole overarching aim for UNETA is to streamline the process, to enable timely access of these treatments to patients. I mean, as we've established before, I think, we can all agree that UNETA is a great idea. And if we can mirror its vision, I mean, happy days, right? I think it will be great for industry, it will be great for everyone. And it's not really in anybody's best interest not to join the bandwagon. But as it stands, because there's these polarized expectations of what stakeholders are hoping for versus what UNETA are working towards, without more meaningful collaboration between stakeholders and UNETA, it's quite likely that there will be this misalignment. And because of this misalignment, like you said, there will be some delays because of that. And I think that there's a huge, there's huge room for this sort of back and forth kind of dynamic that can happen once dossiers are submitted because of this misalignment. And, as a result of this regulation, it's quite possible that the new role for national agencies can be partly shifted to economic evaluations. But I mean, a big but here, right? For individual member states to have no further say or role in the clinical assessments, it would require a homogeneous alignment between member states for this joint clinical assessment at the EU level. And historically, like I've mentioned moments ago, you and I know that there's always been differing opinions about what's considered as acceptable evidence. So point being, you could argue that if there's unclear expectations at the joint level, that's going to further increase the likelihood of member states wanting more clarity after JCA submission. On top of the JCA, it's likely that we're going to have further or additional evidence requests. And that, I think, will be the rate limiting step, this additional hurdle that will delay the process because, we know countries like Germany, for example, or France, who have quite sophisticated processes. If there's no alignment or they can't agree on what this acceptable evidence is going to be, they're just going to wait for the JCA and then request for further evidence. So yeah, I think in that sense, I do think that innovation could be delayed further. But of course, I think this applies to those countries that have well-established systems.
Yeah, I can only agree. I think that's probably one of the cool questions. But maybe we can, let's say, spin that a bit further. Just assuming that, let's say, the processes are somehow, let's say, agreed on a European level. How would you foresee the implementation in individual countries? And you have already mentioned, let's say, more sophisticated process like in France and Germany, but we have obviously, especially across Europe, other countries with maybe call it a lack of resources. How would you see such an implementation on a country or local basic level really be happening?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think, without this alignment, I think that's the $1 billion question, right? I think that's why we're kind of seeing a lot of people sitting on the fence or kind of on edge about or slightly concerned, that with time ticking, there's quite a lot of work to be done, and that there has to be this alignment to ensure that UNETA can be effective. But yeah, so going back to talking about these countries that have more sophisticated processes, as I said earlier in this podcast, I don't really think that we've had much communication from individual countries on how they are going to fit the JCA into their processes. And I think for sure these countries that have these well-established systems will have more challenges integrating the JCA, simply because these intricately designed HTA processes and systems has worked well for them for several and many years. And I think the problem is that there's going to be great difficulty in finding that common ground between member states and UNETA where both parties are happy. And correct me if I'm wrong or disagree with me, but I think if you have a differing opinion, but I think this might be because I think some member states are finding it more difficult or willing to compromise. So because of this lack of compromise, it's going to be quite difficult for these well-established countries to adopt the JCA into their process. This integration, it might take some time, and it might take some back and forth. On the contrary, though, you mentioned these countries that have these lack of resources or not so well-established systems. If we're looking at some Eastern European countries or markets, for example, if we can refer to, Czech Republic or Slovakia, I think for countries such as those that don't have these well-established systems, I think adopting UNETA will be more of a smooth sailing, seamless process, because there's not that integration. It will be more sort of them taking on UNETA as off a clean slate. It will be more of a fresh process for them, and certainly in these countries without these well-established processes, without this, there's absolutely no way that patients can have access to treatments or have access to these innovative therapies. So I think it'll be really great for them. It will be a really great way to enable access to treatments that maybe they might not have been able to before. So in that sense, I think it'll be really great for those countries. But again, I think definitely with countries like Germany and France, it could be a bit of a challenge. And talking about that, I do want to kind of bring an example from one of the feedback comments that was highlighted in the recent deliverables. And this was that, the VFA and the BPI, the leading German pharma associations, they really voiced their concerns about how they feel UNETA have not met the evidence requirements for ATMPs in Germany. And a lot of these views were also mirrored by EU trade organizations. And, this, of course, poses a huge risk for potentially successful ATMPs to fail through assessments purely because there's no alignment in these requirements. And I think that would be a great shame because, everyone wants these patients to have access to treatments, if there's an area of unmet need or, there isn't a standard of care that's available. And certainly in these instances where therapies or potential therapies that are in development that, can demonstrate, great efficacy and great safety, it would be a shame that they fall through these assessments purely on this basis. So, I think I'm not sure it's a bit of a long-winded answer for you there, Stefan, but I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
No, I can only agree with that. I think that's probably one of the core and key issues I would also foresee. I mean, what I have seen in also other discussions related to joint HTA in Europe is, in Canada, they have had a similar kind of, let's say, issue roughly 20 years plus ago, right? They have now also, at least for some of the products, a kind of more national submission, but always with an opt-out option for companies at least. Have you heard anything around something like that, like an opt-out option for either companies, so that they could, for example, just say, you know what, we're not going with our, for example, next CAR T-cell therapy through the EU Joint HTA, but we're just targeting directly the individual countries? Or maybe even that some countries would just say, look, I mean, we're not running for all of the EU Joint HTA submissions, but we're also asking companies to directly maybe submit their cases to us. Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, so we know, Stefan, that actually from January 2025, all ATMPs and oncology therapies will be mandated to undergo that joint clinical assessment at the European level. So there really is no opt-out option from a company's perspective. It's interesting that you bring up the Canadian system, because in a way, I think that system could sort of be seen as a model, like a mini model for the EU HTA, in a way where you have CADIF, which is the national HTA body, essentially conducting that clinical assessment and cost effectiveness assessment on behalf of the provinces. But then it's ultimately a provincial decision as to the reimbursement and at what price they want to reimburse the product. So I think bottom line is the companies can't opt out of it. And I think that's why this is such an important topic. You know, we've in discussions with our clients, you know, we've been starting to introduce this idea that companies need to be future-proofing their evidence generation plans, their strategies moving forward, because this is not something that's going away. So, you know, because of there is no option to opt out, you need to start preparing for this. So if you're a manufacturer and you're thinking, what do I need to be doing now? There's a few things, but I think one important thing is to say, okay, this is going to happen, especially if you're a gene therapy or a cell therapy or targeting an oncology indication, looking at the EU treatment landscape, looking at HTA reports, looking actually key learnings from the UNETA joint action. And what can we take from those pilots that have been conducted before, and see how that actually might map out as we move forward. So I think, the bottom line is that there is no opt-out for companies. From the member state perspective, and this was something that was heavily debated, I know when it was being passed, the legislation was being passed by the European Commission, was whether it was going to be mandatory for the member states to adopt the decision of the joint clinical assessment. And what was decided was that the joint clinical assessment won't actually make any recommendations, as to the reimbursement. It will just do the assessment and leave it up to the member states as to how they interpret it. So I think that's why this discussion of misalignment as well keeps being brought up, because for manufacturers, there's not that level of certainty that although they go through this joint European process, they're still going to have to navigate all of those individual perspectives of the member states afterwards.
Exactly.
So, yes.
I fully agree. I mean, it's maybe just another layer. And it's maybe as well just coming back to what we said a bit earlier, right? It might just even further delay access of innovation to at least some patients across the European continent, I would say. But maybe turn that just towards the end of this podcast episode into a bit more of a positive flavor, because I think, as I think you both said already as well earlier, I think generally the idea is really good, and I think we're living in one. I mean, I'm speaking with two English persons, so I just want to say in one European Union, but obviously having you, let's say, in the episode, it might get a bit tricky, but you know what I mean, right? The current, let's say, the general European idea, I think, is a good idea. I guess you would also agree. So maybe we'll just turn that a bit and just say, I mean, what would be needed in order to make that endeavor, joint HTA, a success?
So my perspective on this, Stefan, is that I think we need to accept there will be some level of uncertainty moving forward, because as with any new system or process, there will probably be some teething issues. So I think there's a lot of concern among industry, with what's going to happen, a discontentment with the level of EUNETA consortium listening to industry's perspective. But I think everybody involved needs to have some kind of acceptance of this I think there's going to be a lot of watchful eyes on what's going to happen with those first few ATMPs and oncology therapies that undergo the joint clinical assessment first, and to see what happens with those. So in a way, I see them being the guinea pigs, if you will, for testing the process, which of course no company wants to be the one to test on the new system. But I think it's especially important that we take those learnings from those first few therapies and look at it as a way to refine the process over time. Because I don't think it's something that is just going to be implemented and it's perfect straight off the bat. So I think accepting a level of uncertainty and understanding that this is the first step in a process to kind of get to where we want to be, and having this alignment at an EU level. And specifically for companies, I think in order to make EU Joint HTA a success, I think they need to look inwards as well. So what can they do to engage with the UNETA consortium and influence and give their perspective on the process, but also looking internally and saying, what can we be doing now to establish the internal processes and teams that will be responsible for developing the joint clinical assessment dossier? Who within our team is going to be involved in that? And can we have internal champions and experts that are going to collaborate to drive that efficiency in the process? Because I think that's something that, again, inevitably will take time to change organizational processes in a company, but is fundamental to making sure that this is successful. But ultimately, I am hopeful, although we've highlighted a lot of the challenges here, I'm hopeful that we can eventually have a system like the European Medicines Agency has managed to do at regulatory level, which does provide a foundation for having a more uniform assessment and a more timely access and equitable access to medicines for patients.
Yeah, let's just keep positive, being positive. Positive thinking, I think, might help. I mean, otherwise, I mean, thanks a lot also for all of your insights. I think it was a really good and great discussion. Some further kind of detail you have also brought into that kind of discussion. I mean, as you already said, I think whoever is planning to launch a product, especially in the oncology/ATMP area in the next, let's say, 2+ years, should now already start thinking and planning for the EU Joint HTA. Thank you both.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for having us.
So great discussion with two, I would also say, experts in EU Joint HTA. And I think both have basically confirmed what we have also discussed in earlier episodes, that finally, and unfortunately, I would also say, HTA organizations across Europe are not yet ready for EU Joint HTA. I think not only the industry, but also the processes and the different payers and people working at those organizations and institutions do not yet know how the process will look like. There's still a lot of debates, a lot of discussions, which are generally obviously be fine. I mean, you need to have that, but ultimately time is pressing, and as we all know, a preparation for submission takes time. It takes time to get the right analysis done, to get the right medical writing done, and then also and finally get the alignment review being done in time. So I think the clock is ticking, but I think ultimately we all need to, let's say, wait a bit. And I think, as both said a couple of times, maybe we just need to still be positive thinking, and just see that as well as a kind of learning process, what we have heard now since 10 years, for example, also in the German AMNOG process. Having said that, with Germany, but also with France, I mean, it will be really interesting to see how that would really look like, how those sophisticated countries and processes would really adapt the EU Joint HTA. I think we have also heard, I think, a lot of debates, for example, what will and how it will be implemented on, or let's say, with products such as with ATMPs, where maybe the evidence base is a bit more tricky than for other products. But what is sure is that the EU Joint HTA will come, and it will start with oncology and ATMPs. So whoever has such a kind of product in their hands or in their pipeline and are planning to launch, let's say, beyond Q4 2024, should now already start thinking and planning in order to be successful in Europe. That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.